So let's wrap up our discussion of groundwater with these three topics of seepage, permafrost, and the frost line. Well, here's what you need to do. You should copy these questions into your notebook as you view the lecture. Don't copy them all down right now because you don't know how much space you're going to need to answer each question. You should see each question come up in the presentation written on the screen so you'll know where you stop and you summarize the answer to that question. So here we got a place where the ground is wet. So water is coming up out of the ground, but this is not an example of a natural spring because this is a really slow movement of water that seems to be oozing out of the ground. This is what's called seepage. Seepage is the slow movement of water through the ground. A lot of times we describe that as coming sideways. Let's look at how this happens here in this situation. So up here on top of the hill, we've got a little retention pond, a place where water has collected. And we know that water wants to infiltrate into the ground. But because of the steepness of this hill, as the water goes down, it gets steep enough and low enough that then the water pokes out sideways. And it does it slowly. So that area of the ground on there is always wet because of seepage. So let's examine how this happens. Up here at the top of the hill, we had the retention pond, and we know water is going to go into the ground naturally. Well, maybe it hits an area where there's clay, and the water has a hard time going in, so it tends to want to move towards the path of least resistance. And then it comes out over here. So this spot over here on the ground is where it's always wet. You can actually see the wetness there matching up that spot there on the ground. This is seepage. It's not flowing water. It's just a place where the ground has water slowly soaking out of it and remains wet. So here's our definition of what is seepage. It is the slow movement of groundwater, usually described as like oozing rather than flowing groundwater. It's not a spring. It's just a place where we get the slow movement of water that keeps the ground damp. So how can this be a problem? Well, think about our houses here that are mostly built on top of basements. If we have precipitation that falls into the ground and we have a lot of clay in our soil, the water doesn't like to infiltrate through the clay that easily. So the water that is trying to get through the clay closer to our basement might say, hey, you know what? It's a lot easier for me to seep through the concrete than it is to go down through the clay. So we get that water that seeps into our basement. And we already saw how porous and permeable concrete is. So you wind up with something like this. You get water that is coming slowly through your concrete block in your basement. That's what's called seepage, and it can be a real problem. So this is just plain block. But now imagine some of our basements that are finished. We have a regular wall, and we have carpet, and people live down there. Well, all of this water down here is going to remain damp. You might not even see it. There might not be enough water coming through the wall to make a puddle on the carpet or to make it where you feel it, but it's there. And that dampness can lead to something rotting, whether it's wood or carpet or drywall, or it certainly leads to the growth of mold. And mold is very bad for us to breathe in, and we don't even know it's there most of the time. So is this a big deal for us? The answer is yes. And it's not an easy yes or no question as to explain why. First of all, we get lots of rain. We get lots of rain trying to go into the ground. The second big problem here is that our soil is made up of mostly clay, which the water doesn't like to go through very easily. So it's going to take the easier path and come into our basements. That's the third big thing for us here, is that most of our homes are built on top of concrete walled basements. So lots of rain, clay in the soil, concrete basements leads to seepage underneath our house, which is bad news. Here's a quick screenshot of companies in Atlanta that perform waterproofing work. These are people that fight these seepage problems that we're going to have here because we have the rain and the clay and the concrete walls in our basements. And this was a very quick search. Some companies do multiple types of jobs. So this must be a big deal for us if there's so many companies that are in this business. So what can they do, or what can we do to help prevent seepage problems? Well, the first option is pretty simple. You take this compound that looks kind of like a paint. One of the brand names is Drylock, and you basically paint it over the inside of your basement walls. And what it does is it stops the water from coming through. It is a non-permeable material. So the water comes into the concrete, but it can't get through that dry lock and end up seeping into the inside of the basement. Now, at this time, what I'm going to have you do, stop, take a second. You'll see this painted block here on your table. And I want you to take a couple drops of water, put it on that side of the block. Just pick an area, and then do the same thing on this side of the block. So pause the video at this time and take a look at this. So what'd you see? Well, what you should have seen was that the water over here just kind of pooled up on the top. It did not go into the brick. Whereas on the other side, the water went into the block pretty easily and would go through the block if you put enough water on it. Well, if these blocks represent our basement walls, this side over here is a problem. And this is a solution that fixes that problem. That's that coating called Drylock, and it helps to keep the water from permeating our concrete walls and winding up in our basement where we don't want it. You'll see this applied to the outside of houses as they're being built because, listen, we know it's Georgia. I'm going to build a house with a basement. It's going to rain a lot, and you can see there's a bunch of clay down here in the soil. And the house hasn't been backfilled yet. In other words, there's going to be dirt piled up against this basement wall. So this black paint that you see here is like that Drylock. They go ahead and paint the exterior concrete walls with that Drylock. But sometimes that's not enough because, let's face it, it rains a lot here. And the water might pool up against the concrete wall and maybe eventually even work its way in. So here's another option that's done. Is you take something like a hose or a drain and you allow the water to leave and get away from the wall entirely. Because sometimes that Drylock sealant just isn't enough. This is why, if you've ever noticed these downspouts that come off the gutters of your house, they take the water off the roof and they run it down to the ground. But most of our downspouts are shaped like this, where it has some kind of end on the bottom of it that points the water away from the house, because I don't want water over here next to the house. Because the more water that's next to the house, the more likely it is to be able to find a way to seep in through those concrete walls. Most of us don't think about this. And a lot of times you might have the bottom part, the angled part of the downspout, maybe you hit it with a lawnmower or it just fell off or whatever. People don't pay too much attention to it. But you should always have these downspouts where they have this bottom piece so that it takes the water away from your house, because you don't want water in the ground next to your house. Here's a kind of even more extreme case of that. This is in my neighborhood. We've got a big hill back up here. And so the water wants to flow downhill and will hit the basement wall of the house. We don't want all that water sliding downhill and piling up against my basement wall. So a drainage system was built, and The water is collected back there in a drain and it's run through a pipe and it's spit out here in the street where we want that excess runoff to go anyway. So to summarize, our second good option that we use to fight this seepage in our houses is to move water away from the house. We increase the drainage, and we can do that a couple of different ways. But get the water away from your house. The third option, and this is not a great option. This is usually done in the case where the house was already built and maybe something changed or somebody didn't take care to help prevent seepage in the first place, where they now have to go back and they have to dig up the dirt around the house, dig it down the basement walls, and then they have to put this fabric on there. They'll line the basement of a house or the bottom of a house with a type of fabric, like a tarp, say, that is impermeable, that water cannot get through. This is an expensive proposition. This would have been a lot easier problem to fix when the house was built. So the third option is probably the least attractive, but if you got a problem, you got to fix it. Now, what is this idea of permafrost and the frost line? Well, when it rains, the water filters through the soil before it gets to the water table. And the water table doesn't freeze. The water deep way underground always stays as liquid water because even though it's colder underground, you don't get sunlight, it doesn't get as cold as it does up at the top because you're kind of insulated by all that dirt above you. It doesn't ever get hot, but it doesn't ever get super cold either when you're deep underground. So the groundwater doesn't freeze. But this water up here that was working its way through the soil to get to the groundwater, the soil can get very cold. And if the soil gets really cold, the water in the soil can then turn to ice. It can actually freeze. Now, this only happens in places that it gets really cold, like Alaska. In Alaska, it stays so cold year-round that basically this water up here never really melts. It pretty much stays frozen year-round. Stays as ice. And that's because up here, it stays cold enough. Now, I know in the summertime it gets above freezing, but the sun has a hard time heating the soil. It takes a long time to heat the ground. And the warm season in Alaska is so short that the ground basically never really thaws out after winter. And that water in the ground stays frozen year round. That's what we call permafrost. Permafrost is water in the ground that stays frozen all year long. And it only happens in places that's really cold. Canada, Alaska. It presents some challenges. If the ground stays frozen, it's really hard to dig in frozen ground. This is from Siberia in Russia, one of the coldest inhabited places on the planet, where if somebody dies in the wintertime and they're going to go bury their body, the ground is frozen and it's almost impossible to dig in. So they actually have to light a little fire. They put a tank here with some coals in it, and they light a fire in order to melt the water that's in the ground so that the ground can then be thawed out and soft enough to dig the grave and put the body in the ground. Now, the problems you have is when this permafrost does decide to melt. And this is a byproduct of climate change. As the planet gets warmer, well, the ground gets a little bit warmer. And maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago, the ground was solid, frozen all year long. Well, now that water is melting a little bit, and the ground is not as solid anymore. Now it's muddy instead of solid. And anything built on top of the ground now starts to move around a little bit because the ground is softer because the water is not frozen. These are all pictures from Alaska where they have trouble, they're having problems with permafrost that is melting. and it's underneath buildings. And now the buildings are collapsing because the ground underneath them is not frozen anymore. Also have a problem with your roads. If the ground under your road starts to thaw out and it gets a little squishy, gets a little soft, well, the road's going to be a little squishy and a little soft. And then you have a problem when winter comes and it refreezes. So it freezes and it thaws every year, whereas it used to just stay solidly frozen year round. Now, the frost line is a little bit different concept, and this applies almost everywhere. So in places that aren't Alaska, but maybe aren't really far south, like Florida, it can get cold enough for some of the water at the surface to freeze. Like up here, maybe it's cold enough, but it's not cold enough year round for it to stay frozen. So the water up top in the soil, maybe it freezes in December or in January and February, but by the time spring comes around and it gets a little bit warmer, that water will thaw out a little bit. This will be happening in a place like New York or Minnesota, where it's not cold enough year round for it to stay permanently frozen, but it freezes every winter and then thaws every spring. The line at which that happens is called the frost line. In the United States, there are frost line depths that are published throughout the country. And this is kind of an estimate of, okay, how far down in the ground will that water freeze solid in the wintertime? And you notice the further north you go, the higher that number is because it's colder longer, so more water in the ground is going to freeze. You notice down here in Florida and even in Georgia, there really isn't much of a frost line because it's hard for us to get cold enough for water in the ground to freeze. Now, can it? Sure. Not for long, and it certainly doesn't freeze very deep. So, if there really isn't a frost line in Georgia, why am I teaching you about this? Remember, one of my big points to you is that you might not always live here. You might go somewhere else and have these frost lines to contend with in your home life. And let's look at how this can be a problem for us. So, if the water under your house freezes, well, frozen water expands and it gets bigger. So your house sitting on top of ground that is becoming bigger is a problem because if it expands, it pushes on your house. And then in the spring, when it melts, your house is going to contract a little bit. It's going to squish the ground down a little bit. Your house is not very flexible. You don't want your house moving around because you'll wind up with something like this. This is a case, this was an abandoned house where nobody was living in it. And you could see the freezing and thawing of the ground, how it was bending and subsequently breaking the house. If you were living in that house, that's obviously not something you want to have happen. You'll see it first in the foundation. You'll see cracks in the part of the house that is holding the house up. That's what we call the foundation, or that bottom, because that's the part that's closest to the ground. So it gets pushed and then pulled or sinks the most when that water in the ground freezes and thaws. So that's bad news. Here you can see on a house that wasn't even built in the ground. It was built up in these blocks. And you see that the posts that are holding the blocks up aren't straight anymore because every winter the water on the ground would freeze and push the blocks a little bit. Well, then every summer the water would sink back down, become a little mushy, and the blocks move a little bit. So over the course of years, the blocks that hold the house up are moving back and forth, which is then going to move the house back and forth. It's going to cause cracks. It's going to make things like windows and doors not align up straight. And in a worst case scenario, it can even break things in the house, like your pipes. Decks. This is where we see the greatest impact of the water in the ground freezing because the decks aren't typically built as deep as the rest of the house, and they're just kind of sitting on the ground. This is a concept known as frost heaving. Frost heaving is when the water in the ground freezes and it heaves or it pushes or it lifts up the stuff that's on it. Well, your deck is attached to your house. And we'll look at how we make our houses steady, but decks aren't made as steady. So the deck gets pushed up in the wintertime when the water freezes, and in the spring, the deck wants to sink back down. So over time, the deck gets loose because it's being wiggled up and down every season. There's cases where decks have even fallen off of houses because over so many seasons, it's been wiggled apart. You can see it down here. You see the cracks there in the patio where the freezing water has pushed the surface up, and then every spring it falls back down. So frost heaving is the movement of an object, usually a house or a deck or part of the house, when water in the ground freezes and it expands, which this is bad news. We don't want this happening to our house. So what do we do to prevent this from happening? Well, the first thing is what we already talked about. Let's make the ground near our house as dry as possible. If we don't have as much water in the ground, it's not going to freeze and it's not going to push on my house as much. So this is always good practice. Keep water away from our house. It's not good for our house's well-being. Now here's another option. We have to anchor our houses. If this house were just built right on the surface and the water here expanded, it would push on the house. So I need to keep the house still. I need to have it anchored. And what you do is you sink your foundation lower than the frost line. You have to. Because if you get your house down there to where the water is not expanding and contracting, well, then it stays in place. And the water is not allowed to push on the house and move it around. So houses that don't have basements, that are built someplace where it gets cold, they have to make sure they build the house deep enough so that they're down there to where the water won't freeze. And that's where that map came in. If you're in Minnesota, you got to build your house down pretty deep. In Georgia, you don't have to go down more than about 5 or 6 inches to be safe. An interesting situation happened to me and my family when we moved to upstate New York, where it's really cold and had a really deep frost line. My dad wanted to have a chimney on the house, and there wasn't a fireplace in the house. So he had a guy come out and he built the chimney, built the fireplace, and built the chimney. And the guy that did it, the contractor that did it, didn't do a really good job. He did not sink the anchors of the chimney deep enough. And the very first winter we were there, the water around the chimney froze and expanded and pushed on the chimney. It didn't push on the house because the house was built to be steady. It was anchored tight enough. But the chimney moved and the house didn't. And we started to notice the chimney was cracking right next to the house. And apparently the year after we left that house, the chimney basically fell off the house because it wasn't anchored below the frost line, and it eventually cracked and fell off the house. The better option when you have a significant frost line is you build a basement. It's one of the reasons why most homes up north have basements, because the basement is going to stay a little bit warmer. So any water in the ground right next to the basement is going to have a real hard time getting cold enough to freeze. So if you keep the water right next to the house from freezing, it won't expand and therefore push on the house and cause you the problems. So you either anchor the house deep enough below the frost line, or you build a basement that will keep the water around the house from freezing.